Hello and welcome to the final event in the Institute for Government's virtual Labour Fringe Programme. We'll be talking about learning lessons before launching an inquiry. This event is kindly supported by the British Psychological Society. The government says that it wants to learn from what went wrong in the COVID-19 response, and it's indicated that there will be a public inquiry, although government has also said that now is not the right time. For the next hour, we'll be discussing how government and indeed other organisations should go about learning lessons from what has happened, both in advance of a public inquiry and during the inquiry itself. And more generally, we'll be looking at how to manage accountability, learning lessons and blame in government. Some of the questions we'll be exploring are: how should government or any organisation create the right conditions for learning lessons? What's the difference between lesson learning and holding people to account? And is it ever right to blame people when things go wrong? Is there a difference between accountability in government and in other organisations? Is the government right that it would be counterproductive to get into a detailed inquiry now? And is it possible to learn lessons while still in the grip of a crisis? We've got a fantastic panel with us to discuss all this and more for the next hour. We've got the Right Honourable David Lammy MP, Shadow Lord Chancellor and Shadow Justice Secretary, who also led the 2017 Lammy Review. We've got Dame Julie Mellor, Chair of the Young Foundation and Demos, and a former Chair of the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, and Kathryn Scott, Director of Policy at the British Psychological Society, and a participant on government's Spy B group, which has been providing government with behavioural advice during the COVID-19 crisis. We're going to open with some introductory remarks from our panel, then we'll have a discussion between the panel and me before opening up to questions sent in by the audience. So if you're one of the audience, if you're watching, please start sending in your questions as soon as you have them. You can submit questions via the questions and answers option on the live stream page. If you're using Twitter, you can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag Lab2020 or IfG Lab2020. This event is on the record, and if you can't catch all of it, there will be a recording available on our website afterwards. Okay, so without further ado, let's get going. David, I'm going to come to you first. You've been a government minister, you're now on the shadow front bench, you led the Lammy Review and you did your own independent analysis of the London riots. Drawing on this rich experience, how do you think government should be held to account whilst also ensuring lessons are learned on COVID-19? Is accountability and lesson learning more difficult in government than other organisations? And should there be a public inquiry? And if so, when? David, over to you.
On reflections and trying as hard as I can, at least to start off, by not being too partisan. And that is to say that obviously the best way to check any government and any executive in our system is with Parliament. That is the brake, if you like, on executive power. And so you have to constantly ask yourself, is that structure has a significant majority? That's hugely important. And it's obviously very, very topical, given that the rules and restrictions that the government are placing the population under, given, if you like, moving beyond a consistent place to a place that ebbs and flows, particularly if we've got to live with the coronavirus. Is Parliament as effective as it needs to be, and is Parliament way? Backbenchers and in the amphitheatre of the House of Commons, but also the work of select committees, and whether that they have quite the power that they should have. I'll just park that there. I obviously led the review into the disproportionality in the criminal justice system. A review really is not, I think, about holding government to account. A review or an inquiry is largely when there's either a very tricky problem that government's struggling with and it needs proper considered thought. And obviously the way I went about doing my review, because I've been asked to do it by David Cameron, was to convene an advisory panel, to make that advisory panel cross-party and clearly also independent, and then to go about doing that job of work over 2 years. I produced a review that was widely thought to be a good piece of work. accepted on both political sides. I actually reported to Theresa Cameron. But what I would say about doing a review is it requires a serious commitment to good faith. And I think it's very, very challenging when government sets up reviews and doesn't implement all of the recommendations, sometimes actually going further than the recommendations, recognising that the problem that I was asked to look into has sadly got worse in our system, not better. And then for inquiries, these are really, really important and are very profound. I'm afraid, looking at Hillsborough, thinking about the Grenfell families, this is the area that I think is most in need of urgent thinking. I think there's now a sense that people are jaded, people are weary, that there's a kicking into the long grass when you set up an inquiry. I think that, as you would expect, we're living through a time when people are more suspicious of experts than they perhaps were previously. So the idea that a judge or someone from the establishment is trusted quite in the way they might have been 20 or 30 years ago, I'm not sure is quite right. I think that whether that's good or bad, and there's something about the speed with which they can work. So when you look at the way the Americans approach their sort of inquiries, it's like a select committee. It's in the Senate or Congress. It's powerful. People are called in, they're wheeled in very quickly. No one can turn them down. There isn't quite that sense, I think, with an inquiry. Things go on for very, very, very long. And particularly where you've also got a police investigation. In Grenfell, you've got a police investigation taking place. You don't hear from the police investigation. And actually, a lot of people think that some of what's happened amounts to criminality. So there are some real issues, I think, with how the inquiry works, how it commands respect and attention, how it's able to come alongside community, and actually, very importantly, the role of lawyers in supporting people who are often vulnerable, disenfranchised, absolutely caught in the spotlight suddenly because of the nature of the tragedy. Another thing that's not gone so well is the Windrush Scandal. Wendy Williams did an excellent review, just like mine. Question, will her recommendations be properly implemented? And question, why is it that the compensation scheme that the government set up again has denied people the right to lose lawyers, has not had sufficient take-up, and is largely seen as a pretty mealy-mouthed compensation scheme that's asking people to get to the standard of beyond reasonable doubt, treating them like criminals when they really ought to be treated as some amongst the most vulnerable victims in the system. Just two more things, because as in my shadow justice brief, I've got to add this into the mix. The everyday way to put checks on government, checks on local authorities, checks on those who make big decisions over our lives, of course, is judicial review. And here again, the executive is challenging judicial review, doing a review into judicial review when it's not clear that there's anything to fix. And we're getting this tone about overreach from our judiciary. And, generally speaking in democracies, when we start to challenge our judiciary and the independence of our judiciary, we're into a worrying place. So what is the evidence for overreach? What is the evidence that they're not on the side of the public? I think we're in this curious place where constantly institutions, whether it's Parliament, whether it's our judiciary, are being put almost in competition to the public, everybody except the executive. So that's my starter for 10.
David, thank you. That was a really compelling description of the different routes available to hold government to account. And I particularly in questions want to come back to some of your comments on public inquiries and how we might reform them to make them more effective, something that the Institute has also done work on. Julie, I'm going to come to you now. You spent 5 years running the Health Ombudsman, where you oversaw a 10-fold increase into investigations of complaints about public services and helped ensure that learning and accountability flowed from that. So how can government and other organisations best respond to mistakes and create the conditions for learning? Is it ever right to blame people when things go wrong? And what does all this mean for accountability and learning on COVID-19?
I want to make the case that if we want to create the conditions for learning, and if we have any hope of whatever is done having legitimacy with the public, we need to take an approach that is completely different to anything that has been done previously, even if it's labelled a public inquiry. And I want to argue that we should involve the public from start to finish. And a first step would be to ask the relevant select committees in Parliament to commission a citizens' assembly to develop the terms of reference. So why do I think that? So I was really intrigued by this question of what's the difference between learning and accountability, because for me and for the public, my experience at the Ombudsman Service, they are the same thing, because they are not about blame. So I'm clear, just for people in the audience to say what the Ombudsman Service does, so that you've got a bit of context. So the Ombudsman Service is the decision maker of last resort, where if an individual takes a complaint against a public service, and we did the NHS and all central government departments, and they're not satisfied with the outcome with the service in question, they can come to the Ombudsman Service for an investigation and a final decision. And we did a lot of research in my first year with the public, and the public were really clear that the one reason they wanted to complain was to prevent what happened to them happening to anybody else. They didn't talk about blame. They wanted something that was open, where people could be, it was safe and people could be honest about the possibility of mistakes having happened. They wanted an acknowledgement if something had gone wrong, and they wanted the relevant service to actually demonstrate what it had done to improve the service as a result of the learning. That's what they wanted. Sadly, their experience has been otherwise. And what we found was a toxic cocktail where institutions were defensive, reluctant to open up, inhibited about learning. And the public, as a result, felt the process lacked legitimacy. They didn't trust it, and so they didn't complain. Or if they did complain, by the time they came to us, they'd had such a bad experience of that defensiveness, and that actually they became entrenched in their own view that they were right. Whereas when we investigated, we upheld less than 50% in hospitals and lower than that in most other organisations. And so they did end up wanting to blame and wanting blood, wanting someone's head to roll. So how do we shift that? So then just to say that I fear that we will have the same fate of any public inquiry, that it won't have public legitimacy and it will be about blame, unless we start quickly, because I think there's a better chance of it being open if it starts quickly and we do it differently. So how do we shift that toxic cocktail to something that is open to learning? I just wanted to tell a little story about a family that I worked with. I'm privileged to work with the most generous spirited family. Their toddler had died of sepsis. It was an avoidable death, which means if without the mistakes, that child would have lived. And those parents were so generous spirited that they argued staff were also scarred by their child's death, that staff feared being blamed and weren't supported to explore if mistakes had been made, and therefore that staff experienced an injustice too, and that resulted that the institution became more defensive and less likely to get near the truth, because it wasn't supporting individuals who were closest to what happened in dealing with it openly. So I think we've got to remember when we're thinking what we design, and this is taking it out of politics with a capital P for a minute, this pandemic is unprecedented in terms of its test of our machinery of state, and our machinery of state has been found ill-prepared and in poor repair. And ministers and officials are having to make decisions with imperfect data on matters that affect the lives of every single citizen of the UK. And they will only know in hindsight if that decision turned out for the best. And so they will be anxious about their responsibilities and the scale of what's happening, as well as fear of blame. And we've already seen several public servants leave high profile roles. So I think the blame game never works if you want learning. And it comes about only if an institution fails to learn and isn't open to learning. And it mitigates against learning because those with the most knowledge of what's happened are put into a defensive mindset. So to me, the kind of critical success factors for whatever we do are public trust, which comes from it being open, learning, and accountable for the learning, psychological safety for people giving evidence, and a mechanism to hold the relevant institutions to account for making the changes. And this is something I know in the Institute for Government's own research. I think it's something like 6 out of 68 public inquiries since 1990 have been followed up by Parliament. But I think the other overwhelming reason to involve the public is because this will be the first public inquiry that is about something that seriously affects the lives of every citizen. So the scale of direct public interest demands a new approach. So I would say, how do you deal with that? 4 things. Public set the terms of reference, I've already mentioned, get Parliament select committees to commission a citizens' assembly. Parliament have experience of doing it, so it wouldn't be a first. They've done it fairly recently on the funding of social care, and only last week on how does government get to net zero, or we get to net zero by 2050 as required in law. The second thing I'd say, and apologies, David, to you as a lawyer, but don't lawyer up. I have found it fascinating listening to a lawyer that had led a very big public inquiry who said, lawyers are trained and used to an adversarial system. If you involve lawyers, it will focus on blame, have more of a focus on blame. It will be harder to get to the learning in this kind of very public inquiry. And then the third thing I'd say is once you've established the facts, give the public the job of making the recommendations. I think the wider public will be much more confident about the perception and reality that it isn't rigged if it's the public that come up with the recommendations. And that's because they're unencumbered by any need to consider their popularity like politicians are. They're brilliant at compromising. They're brilliant at managing trade-offs and making recommendations between universality of a service and not increasing taxes. And therefore, I think a citizens' assembly recommendations would enable politicians to be brave. And the last thing would be Parliament should agree up front that it's going to hold government to account for the action it takes based on the learning.
Julie, thank you. Really compelling description of how to reform the public inquiry process, and particularly interested in spending a bit more time on the citizen assembly approach that you've suggested. Before we come on to that, Kathryn, I'm going to come to you now. You're the Director of Policy at BPS and a participant on SPI-B, and you focus on how psychology should inform government decision making. So what are the psychological underpinnings of accountability? Julie has started to touch on this. What does best practice tell us about how to balance that, sometimes legitimate desire for blame with the need to learn? And what does this mean for better government and decision making in the COVID-19 crisis?
Thank you. So as psychologists, we like to think about both individuals and the context or the environment in which they're operating in. So we think in systems, but we focus on the people at every kind of part of the policy and decision making process within that system. So I want to consider what accountability looks like at those different levels. So I want to talk briefly about the psychology of surrogate decision making, so making decisions on behalf of others, and also a little bit about actually what Julie just mentioned about psychological safety in an organisation and what that might mean for a future inquiry. So when people are making decisions on behalf of others, so surrogate decision making, we call it, we think differently. And there are a number of factors that come into play, and these all would need to be kind of understood through the process of inquiry. So these can include distance, so that's how far physically are we from those who are impacted by a policy, but also what that means in terms of relative privilege and economic terms. We need to ask the question, are our policymakers representative of those communities that they serve? And then there's also a bit around the kind of psychological understanding of risk perception, of the kind of numbers of people who've been impacted by a disaster or a disease. And in thinking about that, we need to confront what what Professor Paul Slovich calls the deadly arithmetic of compassion, and that the more people who die, the less we care. And that's a concept that we know as psychic numbing, and that distance that creates, the bigger the numbers get. We do value individual lives greatly, but those lives lose their value in face of greater threats and as those numbers get bigger. And then I think there's also a serious empathy gap. So we know through psychological research that our ability to take another person's perspective with any sense of accuracy is actually really small. And that means both that we can get decisions that we make on behalf of others completely wrong. And secondly, it means that we miss the emotion. We miss how those decisions make people feel. And we know that even through studies of doctors who are working face to face with patients. And we know that they've been known to kind of underestimate the pain that patient in front of them is in. So you can imagine how that challenge translates to policymakers with people that they will never meet. So I think the lesson here for a COVID inquiry is to think about, in very similar to what Julie's just said, actually, about how and when to involve those people whose lives have been impacted. There's a choice here, and as we're thinking about these terms of reference, there's various flavours of inquiry that we might get. We could get one that's very process and procedurally focused, or we could get one that asks how people felt about the policy decisions that were made. We could get people wanting to understand what could have been done to reduce their anxiety, the anxiety that people are feeling on a day-to-day basis, and how those decisions taken in Whitehall and Westminster actually impacted them in their homes. So we know there are some challenges around accountability. So I want to look at kind of how do we incorporate that into a process where we can foster learning rather than blame. And this is where the concept of psychological safety comes in. So it's a term actually devised by Professor Amy Edmondson, who's a psychologist at Harvard. And she explains it as a belief that you will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. So it's the belief that you will not be exposed to a threat to yourself, your social identity, or your status in the workplace by raising concerns. So it's about environment and about context. And we know that many people feel they can't speak up even in normal working environments. So adding a political dimension makes it even more difficult. So best practice, we know that in most workplaces, that means framing challenge as learning. It means having leaders who acknowledge fallibility and who model curiosity. It means having leaders who, rather than say, well, why didn't you come to me with that risk or with that challenge, but those who say, I wonder what it is about my behaviour or about the structures that we've created that has presented this challenge from being heard. So that's a culture question. And so this is what you see in places where we do have good practice, like, the MOD's reasonable challenge guidance, companies who work with a culture of red teams, there's lots of kind of examples from the airline industry where they have an operational methodology called PACE, which is about encouraging co-pilots to probe for better understanding, to alert their captain if they feel there's an anomaly. Excuse me, put my teeth back in. And also to kind of challenge the strategy that's in play and for emergency warnings as well. So it's also important to note that psychological safety isn't actually something that's just built up over time. It doesn't need teams that have been together for a long time to build that. And actually, some of the best examples of teamwork come from teams that have been established in response to a crisis. And that you can be drawing similarities from that with thinking about all the different bits of the civil service and different members of the civil service who would never have worked together before. And that there must be, they're all new teams, so they don't have those established norms. So again, this brings us back to kind of what those terms of reference could look like, and we may be thinking about encouraging something that goes beyond kind of procedures and process and procurement decisions, and to actually think about what systemic change needs to happen and to be thinking about culture. And so another big recommendation here for us as the BPS is that we would like an inquiry to include not just what decisions were made and who by, but what context they were made in. What is the culture around those decision makers, and were they able to operate from a place of psychological safety? Was there a culture where people could raise concerns without fear they would lose their jobs, or were they worried they'd be scapegoated? And I think also this might be something that we could pick up on. It's also about that, because I'm representing a kind of the psychological discipline. I'm representing a body of scientists, you know, and I'd also like to include an inquiry that looked at the culture of evidence use and the relationships around challenge, concern and ideas from scientists and experts, and how that was heard, and whether we could kind of be integrating that kind of sense of kind of professional humility and curiosity around the evidence base, as well as kind of some of that decision making. So yeah, that's my opening, but I'll leave it there.
Brilliant, thank you, Kathryn. Really fascinating insight into some of the psychological underpinnings of this. And again, you know, an emphasis there on the dangers of blame culture, and really interesting points on including context when it comes to decision making. So I've got a few questions that I'd like to ask the panel. I want to remind the audience again that there is also going to be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So please do use the Q&A function on this event to ask questions, or ask them via Twitter. So one of the things that I think all of you mentioned is the importance of reforming the public inquiry process. I think I certainly got a sense that you all feel it's not working as effectively as it could be. Julie, you outlined some really powerful changes, including a much greater role for the public. David and then Kathryn, I wanted to come to you both first to ask, what do you think the reform of the public inquiry process should look like, and do you agree that there should be a citizens' jury, or at least a much greater role for the public in any inquiry on COVID? David, I might come to you first.
Well, I think the starting point is, the tradition is to appoint someone from the great and good. The government makes that call and makes that judgment. It doesn't currently really make that judgment in consultation with the opposition or with Parliament. I'm not sure that's any longer satisfactory. And I think it's particularly problematic where you have high profile cases that may involve state power and questioning of state power and state decisions. And clearly Grenfell falls into that category. And I think we learned from Hillsborough that there was a relationship between the government and policing at that time, and a desire, frankly, to cover up. And so I think that there does have to be a different way of coming to the truth with a panel of concerned individuals. And my starting point for that would be parliamentary, because Parliament isn't afraid of government, if you see what I mean. Its whole job is to challenge government in our system. But I like the idea. I mean, certainly in my book, I talked about citizens' assemblies and the role of citizens' assemblies and that sort of renewal of democracy. So I quite like that idea. I'm not announcing Labour front policy from the front bench, because we're a long way off Labour having to produce its manifesto. But I do like that. And I do recognise that you might need more than just Parliament, particularly in framing the terms of reference and getting on with things. But there are some other things I'd want to mention. Oversight and ensuring that recommendations are followed through, ensuring that there are 3-year, 5-year updates from those recommendations, holding those who are meant to take forward those recommendations to account for what has gone on, I think is really important. So oversight, I think, is important. And then there are real issues, again, when you're dealing with the potential for serious cover-up. Clearly, if you look at Grenfell, we're talking about some very big private organisations in construction that have the means to cover up, and you have government, local authority and others also in the frame. And therefore you have to have a new kind of public accountability. And there is actually a private members public accountability bill before Parliament, which is about finding ways very early on to convene the information and hand that information, if you like, to the victims of tragedies and things, and put power back into their hands. I think that things like duty of candor, the encouraging, if you like, whistleblowing and thinking hard about that is really, really important. You know, there's a sort of assumption that, in a sense, Britain's a lot. But often you do get the truth, but you might not get the truth in Britain for a good 30 years. That's the general kind of assumption. And we've just got to do better now. And I think the public appetite, the world we're in, and perhaps also a more fragmented, divided, polarized society where trust isn't the same as it was in a more homogenous country 30 or 40 years ago, requires this kind of reform. I hear, sorry, last point, I hear what was said about lawyers. I just got to, I mean, I think that that perhaps in the kind of inquiry that will take place as a result of the pandemic and how the pandemic was handled, where it may not be the case that criminality is being looked at, yes, but where you've got families challenging state power, Hillsborough, Grenfell, Marchioness, those sorts of tragedies, I'm afraid you have to arm those families with an independence and an articulacy and a power in the system. And the only means by which democratic societies have come up with that is through Parliament and through their own independent legal advice. So I do think there's got to be a role for lawyers, and shutting them out is dangerous.
Thank you, David. Kathryn, I wanted to come back to you on the reform process for public inquiries. How should they change?
I think what Julie was saying about, you know, I think there's a real point around another sort of objective of an inquiry is about for the public to feel heard, for those who've been impacted to feel heard. There's a sense of catharsis about, you know, being able to kind of get justice for who was involved. And then there's also another objective around kind of faith and trust in government and in public institutions. And I think that's where, because the kind of what we're looking at with a COVID inquiry would be so broad, I think if you asked the public, what do you want out of this? You know, that's what they're going to want to hear. You know, they're going to want to explain how they felt about what a policy meant to them. They're going to explain how not being able to go and hug their grandma was really, you know, upsetting for them. And, you know, and that's the sort of message that you don't get heard at a sort of normal interaction with level of interaction with government. So it is that sense of, you know, that there's what we encounter as a kind of psychologist working with public policy and with government is there's almost a sense that you can design policy that won't affect people emotionally, you know, that it's all very black and white, it's all very process driven, whereas actually, you know, you can create fear with policy, you can create stigma, you can create shame, you can create inclusion, and you can create a sense of identity, and there's things you can do in response to that. So I think if I understand the sort of difference between different types of inquiry, but, you know, as we're thinking about this being unprecedented and involving almost every single person of the in the UK, sorry, my son has just come home. And, you know, I think that is where, if you asked the public to get involved in that and said to them, you know, what's important, what lessons do you want the government to learn? I think you'd get a very different type of inquiry.
Thanks, Kathryn. Julie, I wanted to pick up on the question of time and the appropriate timing for an inquiry. David, you said that you know, sometimes we get the truth, but we can wait 30 years for it. And one of the questions I've got coming through on the Q&A is what's a reasonable amount of time for a public inquiry? Is there a danger that by opening up the kind of scope of an inquiry, that introducing new mechanisms for involvement actually lengthens the inquiry process, and means, for instance, in the case of the COVID inquiry, that we could be looking at an even longer period for hearing inquiry conclusions? I suppose what I'm really asking is how important is speed, and what's the balance between speed and giving enough time to really get truth and make sure the public feel involved?
The short answer is I don't know. But if you take the stuff about involving the public, then they can work very quickly. I mean, I had it was humbling watching. I helped facilitate some of the Citizens' Assembly on climate change, and it was humbling watch them digest huge amounts of data and interrogate witnesses, so that the witnesses were saying, well, I've never had it that tough from anyone when I've been questioned before. And they had 4 weekends. I mean, yes, the fourth weekend ended up being bits of 3 weekends because COVID had hit and it went online, but they had 4 weekends. And if you read the report, it's extraordinary, the kind of depth of thinking and breadth of thinking that went into that. That's 4 weekends. It didn't take forever. And so I think, you know, coming up with terms of reference wouldn't have to take that long. I think the reason I say I don't know is because I think it's the bit in the middle which I know less about, that I don't have recommendations on what we do, which is that bit of establishing the facts. And that may be the absolutely right place to involve lawyers in establishing the facts, so that then a Citizens' Assembly has all that evidence to then say, you know, what are our recommendations for improvement? So that's the bit I don't know about. And going back to David's question about, you know, do select committee powers need refreshing? Well, one of the challenges at the moment in trying to think about how to do this in a different and creative way, given that it's affected us all, is that the powers of demanding evidence and witnesses currently rest in the conventional public inquiry process. And so that might be something that in the future, I don't think it will be in time for this, but in the future is something where parliamentary select committees have greater power. But if they do, I think with that power comes the responsibility to listen to the public, because otherwise, you know, as I said, the public are unencumbered by the desire to be popular that politicians need in order to get re-elected. And you know, the history of the way that select committees, it is an adversarial kind of fight almost. And I would like to see that done differently if Parliament had those powers to obtain evidence.
Thanks, Judy. Kathryn, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just thinking on the timing in terms of kind of, if it is about learning and if it is about improving practice and improving culture and looking at how you can do things better, like we know that this, you know, the pandemic is not over and is unlikely to be over for quite some time. So, you know, I think about if we're looking at how you might incorporate new ways of working, and if it was something to be looking at how one might improve psychological safety, you could start doing that straight away. That's not something where you need to wait for it to be over. And I don't know, like, when would it ever be over, you know? And I think that's really something to reflect on.
So that the question of timing in the sense of when do we start is something I wanted to come back to. With the news about possible further restrictions or even some kind of new national lockdown, I think it's never been clearer that we're very much still in the grip of this crisis. Are there things that government can do right now ahead of a public inquiry to start creating a culture of learning? And should government go about lesson learning in a different way when it's in crisis mode? Is it more difficult for it to go about lesson learning when it's in crisis mode? Who wants to jump in first?
I mean, look, my instinct tells me that, as again, where you've got groups challenging state power and state cover-up, you've probably got to get on with it. But there are questions about what has been in the past very cumbersome inquiry kind of mechanisms that you can understand could get in the way just of good government. And, you know, in the midst of a pandemic, we've got to get on with dealing with the pandemic. However, there's an irony to this. You know, at the beginning of this pandemic, and I think any objective analysis would suggest what you want in any pandemic or any problem such as this is for a country to hang together, for the issues not to become partisan, and for a sort of a united approach to how we deal with it. It's very sad that we're at this point now, you know, almost 6 months in, where perhaps because Parliament was shut out, because the executive had just got a massive mandate from the people, 78-seat majority, it assumed it could kind of take the public. But actually, it's becoming increasingly clear. It may have taken a segment of the public, but there's a substantial segment of the public, and I think it goes beyond the left-right axis, that it hasn't managed to take with it. And therefore, you then get into confidence about the learning that's required as you go forward, and also tensions tensions between the sorts of decisions that people vicariously elect people to decide and make judgments on, i.e. the politicians, and experts, specialists in the field, scientists, who are there to provide this thing will manifest and move forward. And there are tensions there, and it's just not entirely clear where the lines of response ought to be. So my instinct is, look, we've got to get on with it, generally speaking. There may be circumstances, I can think of the Iraq War being one, where it's not gone well, there has to be an inquiry, but it might be very challenging to suggest that there can be an inquiry whilst you've got soldiers in the field of battle.
Thanks, David. Julie, what are your thoughts on the timing question and whether there's anything that government can do now?
So Una O'Brien, who was a previous permanent secretary in the Department of Health, has argued publicly that we should start straight away. And I would have preferred if we'd started in the first wave, and although I didn't expect the second wave to hit so quickly, you know, there might have been some early lessons for the second wave that the public would have had greater confidence in if there had been more involvement. But I think what we can get on with, whatever government decides, is Parliament could commission the Citizens' Assembly now to come up with terms of reference. It might be as we move it through, there would need to be a reconvening of that to consider further terms as our experience changes. But we could get on with that now, and I think it would improve public confidence in how the lessons are going to be learned longer term if that happened.
Thank you. Kathryn, do you think there are things government can do right now to help create a culture that is focused on lesson learning?
I think there's something about kind of openness and transparency, and I think that's something that we've experienced, like as a participant on the SPI-B, on the behavioural science group. There's almost a bit of a one-way street in terms of, we're asked to kind of create the evidence base and present that upwards, and then there's very little that kind of comes back down in terms of how that's been used and how that's been translated into policy. And I think that's something that we'd like to see some attention paid to. I think in terms of the organizational culture, I mean, it's huge for any organization to kind of get into those conversations and to be really kind of, thinking about what that looks like. So to start that in government right now, I think, it should be done, but it's not going to be easy. There are occupational psychologists working in government, and I think that would be a very good place to start. And there's certainly methodologies and things that could be looked at. But I think in terms of kind of what needs to happen now, I mean, I think the terms of reference, we need to sort of know which direction that's heading in before we can kind of begin to uncover some of these questions.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, we've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to start turning to some audience questions now. The first one picks on something that all three of you have mentioned, which is the importance of actually implementing recommendations. So Susanna says, some amazing work has been done on reviews and inquiries, but it seems in some places to be pushed aside by the government. Is there a mechanism to ensure widely accepted recommendations are brought into practice? So I think that is there, and if there isn't, what mechanism do you think should exist? David, how do you think that inquiries should be? How should we ensure that inquiry recommendations are implemented?
I'd like to see some sort of oversight body that is returning to the issues and returning to the public. And it's got to be proximate to the victims, and the people behind why the inquiry has been set out. That could be parliamentary. You could have a stronger relationship, for example, between an appropriate parliamentary committee, or indeed actually you could have a new parliamentary committee that was sort of dedicated to inquiries, that was chaired and the members of that inquiry really felt passionate about getting to know the Grenfell families, getting to know the Hillsborough families, getting, certainly if that sort of committee existed, believe me, as a backbencher, I'd have been on it. So it's certain kinds of parliamentarians that want to be, want to do that, and maybe they have oversight, maybe they return powerful reports, but there's still something about beefing up, I think, how select committees currently work and giving them just more status, more legal basis than I think that they currently have, if that were the mechanism. I don't want to say that I have all the answers in terms of who should do it, but I think there has got to be some statutory basis by which there is a responsibility to return to recommendations, responsibility not just to leave victims hanging once the report is concluded, or even the inquiry chair is no longer with us. I mean, you can think of really important pieces of work, Scarman, Macpherson and others. It's got to be more than just the chair that has the job of seeing it through and returning to it long after governments are no longer there.
Thank you. Kathryn, Julie, did either of you want to come in on the how should they be implemented? Kathryn?
Yeah, I mean, just another potential benefit of including the public and defining the terms of reference for an inquiry is that you're going to get greater buy-in, and you're going to have less chance of sort of losing that institutional memory, or people changing government and the recommendations getting put on a shelf somewhere. So I think that's just another kind of benefit of that, is that you're going to get people more concerned to see it through.
Thank you. Julie?
Yeah, two thoughts. I mean, one is ensure that government accepts the recommendation, which is what was in Susanna's question. No, because government will do whatever it will do. But Parliament's job is to scrutinise government. And so I love David's idea of having a select committee that might follow up public inquiries. And honestly, as the Ombudsman for Public Services reporting to Parliament, I was jaundiced by my experience of working with Parliament, because we would make a big noise in the press on our thematic report on things like too many people dying of sepsis, and committees would hold a short hearing and sometimes do a report and if you don't have that follow-up, you get ministers to come and give evidence to the committee when the report's published, but then if you don't have the follow-up, nothing happens. So I think it is a change in the way of thinking about how. But I agree with Kathryn that actually, if you have a citizen making the recommendations, I go back to the point I made in my opening remarks, which is they will have dealt with those really, what are the most difficult trade-offs that politicians will have to make decisions about in whatever recommendations come out of an inquiry. And so they will make it easier for the politicians to be brave, because they'll know that they can say to the public, the Citizens' Assembly said, this is how we should strike that balance. And so I think it makes it easier for them to be brave.
Can I just put one other thought, because I happened today to speak to the Inspector for Prisons in the course of obviously the role that I'm in. And it does occur to me that inspectorates in our system are one way in which you get consistent follow-up, sometimes thematically, certainly on an institutional basis, and they do scare and challenge not just governments, local authorities, schools, prisons, a whole raft of things. So that there is a sort of way in which, if you did have this oversight, that sort of consistent challenge to make better could be built into the system.
That's really interesting. Thank you, David. Okay, next question. It has been mentioned that having decision makers that represent the affected community demographics more closely is important. Given the lack of politicians from a working class background, ethnic minority background, or living with disabilities, how can it be ensured that people's experiences are fully represented in an inquiry? Julie?
So, I mean, of course, it's better in politics if our politicians represent the society from which they come. And when I used to chair the Equal Opportunities Commission, we worked with all the political parties on trying to do that, and made some really good progress actually in doing that on gender alone. I think there are two other things that are important though. One is how do you get your evidence, and making sure you get your evidence from every section of society, from all parts of the country, from all socioeconomic groups, from white and ethnic minority people, people with disabilities, older, young, etc. You've got to do that in your evidence gathering, and something like this I think would have to have regional hearings to gather the evidence from across the country. But the other thing is, when you do a citizens' assembly, while it cannot be completely representative because it's about 100 people. If you look at the process of putting it together, when we did the Citizens' Assembly on climate change, I don't know all the detail because I wasn't involved, but the Sortition Society wrote to about 60,000 people asking them if they would like to take part. About 2,000 people, I think, said yes. And then the Sortition Society worked with Involve, where I'm a trustee, to actually look at how do we, from those 2,000, get a group of 100 that are from every part of the country, from every socioeconomic group, from every ethnic group, balanced in terms of gender and age. And so that's one of the ways you can do it, and it is already done in the construction of a Citizens' Assembly.
Thank you, Julie. Kathryn.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to kind of add to that is, thinking again specifically about COVID, you had the kind of mutual aid groups that sprang up in response to the pandemic, and I think that's something, they're right at the grassroots. They're the ones who are kind of experiencing everything kind of firsthand, and one of the things that we've been looking at is how do you kind of harness the sort of power of those groups and continue to sort of support them, and for them to be useful throughout the pandemic. They kind of were created for a purpose, but as that purpose becomes less necessary in terms of delivering box of eggs to your neighbour, it's about how can you use that to sort of harness that goodwill and that energy around making things better for the response to the inquiry.
Thank you. David, did you want to come in?
Well, I think it's important that, because I've challenged in this area before, I explained with my review, I set up an advisory group. Keir Starmer was on it, actually, from the Labour side, long before, well, he may have dreamed of being leader, but he was not leader at that stage. He just left the DPP and come into Parliament. But we also had Sean Bailey, who's running to be the Conservative candidate for mayor, on the advisory panel, trying to get breadth. Conservative Prime Minister asking a Labour backbencher to lead a review. And of course, we've had countless inquiries that have largely been led by white upper middle class men. Does that mean that they're not seen as having done fantastic pieces of work? Scarman, McPherson would demonstrate that that's not the case. However, I think there are problems if we're always reaching, frankly, for white upper middle class men. And certainly if you're going to look at the judiciary, the tendency is that would be overwhelmingly what you reach for, because there aren't enough Brenda Hales. And I raised some issues around Morbic. It was not, can he empathise, can he produce a great report? But it was that, look, I felt very strongly, because I felt it in my gut, having spent housing estate, there's something about you're in the hands of the emergency services if the building's burning to get you out. And I just felt, if you've grown up in one, if you've lived in one, if you've canvassed in one, if you know one, that's kind of important. But, as I said that, I also thought if you're a woman and you know what it is to give birth in an NHS hospital, and you are absolutely relying on those doctors to deliver what those people were feeling in Greville, i.e. your hands, your life is in the hands of the public service. And so in our system, again, you come back to Parliament, because not that it's entirely representative on gender, on disability, on LGBTQ, or indeed on ethnicity, but broadly speaking, the breadth of experience that MPs have, they're generalists, they represent diverse areas in lots of different ways, rural, urban, suburban, black, white, rich, poor. You get a breadth, and it's that breadth that you need to command public respect and attention.
Thank you. And just picking up on that and some of the questions that we're getting, who should chair the public inquiry? What type of person should chair the public inquiry? Should it be another judge? Should it be somebody completely different? What do you all think?
I was just wondering whether you could have, we quite often in psychology, you know, we have the concept of experts by experience, and you know, we're always thinking about how can you meaningfully involve service user expert by experience in that process. And I was just thinking, I wonder if you could have a co-chair. I wonder if you could appoint somebody who's, you know, from your citizens assembly, who's kind of appointed to kind of sit alongside and to be the, we use that when we're developing policy sometimes at the BPS, a similar sort of model. So it might be more about distributing responsibility and having a number of people in different roles rather than it resting on one person's white male shoulders.
Thank you. Julie, David, did either of you want to come in?
Well, just to say, I don't have a view. I haven't thought that far, but I was listening to someone else. In fact, it was the lawyer who said, "Don't lawyer up," who'd chaired public inquiries himself, who said, you know, it doesn't have to be a lawyer, but what might be good is someone who and maybe, I hadn't thought of this until this moment, but maybe going back to the Citizens Assembly idea, maybe it's a Citizens Assembly appointments process, so it has the trust of the public.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, one last question, and I think we're going to be out of time, from Rick. Should the UK be looking at some form of automatic triggering mechanism for inquiries? We seem to be at the mercy of government preference. So should they be triggered automatically rather than by individual government choice?
Probably, I would have thought there shouldn't be too much in the hands of the executive to sort of fix the terms of reference, fix who's leading it, and fix when you're having it, in my view.
Kathryn?
It's difficult because obviously, you know, we've got inquiries about things on really different scales, and also inquiries are not the only mechanism by which, you know, you can scrutinise and hold to account. So what an automatic trigger would look like, I can't begin to think what that would be, but just to point out that we do have a range of kind of accountability mechanisms, and that might not be the right one every time.
So I'm actually going to ask one last question, having said that would be the last one. Is an inquiry the only way to do this? I mean, we've had this discussion, rightly supposing that there's going to be a public inquiry, I'm sure, but what other mechanisms should we be looking at to hold government to account and to ensure that learning happens as a result of COVID?
There's one other, we don't have them really over here, but it's a legal remedy that can be incredibly effective, and it's class actions. It's where people are able to join together, go to the courts and really challenge power. I think it works best when it's not actually government power, it's corporate power. And whether it's baby milk, tobacco, certainly in the United States, it's a mechanism by which people can get to the truth and drag big corporate power to the table. And again, I'm not saying that we should have it here from the front bench, but it sometimes occurs to me that mechanism has not really been in the British system available to people.
Thank you, David. Julie, Kathryn, any final thoughts? Okay, in which case we're basically at past, so I think I'm going to have to draw this to a close. What a brilliant, insightful discussion with excellent questions. I hope all those involved in considering a public inquiry into COVID-19 are listening. We will make a video and audio podcast available of this event on our website as soon as possible. Until then, thank you to our panellists. Thank you to the British Psychological Society for supporting this event. And thank you to you, the audience, for listening in. Thanks very much.